Hey everyone, and welcome to Dominion Cards, the video series where we take a strategic, in-depth look at various cards from the board game Dominion. So today, slightly differently to what we normally do, I'm going to be talking about these 7, what we call the base cards. So these are the cards that show up in absolutely every single game of Dominion. This sort of video was more of a viewer suggestion, and it was a pretty good one, I thought. So rather than do like a load of videos about each of these individually, I thought, why not just pile them all into one big video? Now, it is going to be a pretty big video because there's a lot to talk about here, so we're going to try and get through it fairly quickly. So why specifically talk about these cards in general? Well, I think the main reason why is because as all of these can be purchased, they are something that you have to consider in the general opportunity cost of what cards you pick up. These cards do factor into that. You know, sometimes picking up these cards will be better than the other options that are available. So that's going to impact your strategy, understanding when it is that you want to get these things. During this video, I'm going to be talking a lot about a concept called stop card. Every single one of these cards is a stop card. If you don't already know what this means, it's just that they don't draw other cards. Similarly, there's a concept that I like to refer to as stop card space, and that basically means as the cards, your hand only supports a certain number of cards, which is going to be equal to, obviously, the number of cards in your hand. And if they're all stop cards, you can't draw anymore. So stop card space generally refers to the number of stop cards that you can support until your deck just sort of stops being able to do everything that you want it to do. Now, because this video is quite long, I don't want to go too much into details of certain very specific combos with some of these cards. I'd rather talk in the more general case. So if you're ever wondering why I'm not talking about Fountain when I'm talking about coppers, or cards like Feodum when I'm talking about silver, or Baron when I'm talking about estate, that is specifically because I think those discussions would be better had in the video about those particular cards, and to just use this opportunity to talk more generally about these cards here. So we're going to start off with the 3 treasures, copper, silver and gold. We're going to start off with copper because that is the card that you first see and that you got the most of at the start of the game. So if you weren't already aware, copper is actually a pretty bad card. It's very, very weak. It's incredibly inefficient for the amount of coin it gives compared to the stop card space that it takes up. Of course, it needs to be weak. This is a deck building game. The whole point of the game is to improve your deck over time, and if the cards that you started with were actually really good, then there wouldn't be very much improvement for your deck to go through. So copper, it's not unusable, but it is pretty weak. Now, you start off with 7 of these. That's quite a lot of weak stop cards to have, and they all sort of get in the way, and while they are necessary to generate money, you need them at the start of the game, they clog you up very quickly. So something that brand new players to the game do is they think, copper, it generates me a coin. Maybe if I have a buy and I'm not buying anything else, I only generated 1 money or 0, I should buy a copper. And I wouldn't recommend doing that most of the time. And that's just because copper is so weak. And the stock card space is really important. You can definitely do better than that. So don't buy it just because you happen to have a spare buy available. Now, because you start off with so many coppers, you usually want to trash them as soon as you can. You want to get the weak cards out of your deck and swap them for much, much better ones. Use the stock card space on something that's a lot stronger. Coppers cost 0, and that's sort of a problem sometimes when you want to trash them because it makes them very bad for certain trashers. So we talked about remodel in our videos. That's the cost-relevant trasher in the base game. Remodel really doesn't like being played on coppers because the card that you gain from the remodel ends up also being pretty weak. So this is sort of the big deal with coppers in a way, that trashing them, sometimes it's very easy. You got Chapel, doesn't really care about the cost, but sometimes it's not actually quite that easy to get rid of them. Now, if you can't trash your coppers at all, this could often be a big problem because 7 stop cards is actually quite a lot to draw through stuff, so it really slows down strategies that want to try and draw all of the cards in their deck. If you can't trash coppers, it's a lot of stop cards to get through, and you're not really getting much out of it. You have to add a lot of draw to your deck until you're finally at the stage where you can push through all of the coppers, But it also tends to be somewhat unreliable just because you have so many of them. With 7 stop cards, it's more likely that you end up drawing a load of them than your start hand, and then that can sort of kill you. So, so watch out for that. Getting rid of coppers is very important for doing the powerful sorts of decks that draw all of your cards. Now, it's not all bad, copper. So, you do need coppers to actually afford to buy anything at the start of the game. If you didn't have the coppers, you wouldn't be able to buy any cards except coppers. So, they're not so useless in the fact that, you must use them at the start of the game. And of course, because you have 7 of them, that means that you didn't have to buy them. So there was sort of no opportunity cost involved with adding a load of them to your deck at the beginning of the game. So given that you were given them for free, you might as well try and make the most out of them where you can. So if you trash them very, very quickly, like you can with Chapel, what you can find is that because you're so reliant on copper at the start of the game for your economy, you can very quickly sort of run out of money to buy the sorts of cards that you want to do. So that sort of, just sort of exemplifies the way that you are actually pretty reliant on the money that you're generating from the coppers at the start of the game, even though they are a weak card. And because you have so much density of copper, at the beginning of the game, if you add draw cards into your hand, so cards that will increase your hand size, you find that because you have more coppers in your hand, you tend to be able to purchase more expensive cards. So this gives way to something that I talked about in the Smithy video, where I sort of say that draw is economy. Instead of adding like a silver to your deck, sometimes just drawing more cards at the start of the game will sort of have an equivalent benefit in terms of allowing you to buy more expensive stuff. But what it also does is it lets you get through your deck more quickly. That means that the newer, better cards that you add, you see again more quickly because you shuffle more often. Once you buy a good card, it goes to your discard pile and you have to shuffle before you can play it again. And in general, every card that you buy, every shuffle is an opportunity to play it another time. And so you sort of multiply the value of the cards that you add to your deck by playing them more. A card is more useful to you if you play it more often. Just reiterating here, sorry, I'm just reading my own slides. This is quite a big one, so I can't remember everything as easily. The coppers are very, very inefficient in terms of your stop card space. So even though drawing will get you more money, ultimately the goal tends to be that you want to trash them eventually, and that is just because the stop card space is often much more of a premium than the availability of coin, right? Like even silver is going to be giving another way of getting money that's easy to get, and it just takes up less stop cards. So you would much rather, trash the coppers and get a silver instead, just because the stop card space is really what you care about more a lot of the time. Copper on its own struggles to get 5. 5 is a really important price point. There's a lot of very good cards at 5 compared to cards like at 4, usually. Copper struggles to hit 5 on its own because you have those estates at the start of the game and you will be adding other cards. And that is just because your hand is 5 cards. So, that's... As long as there's something else in there that's like not a copper, well, you can't hit 5 anymore. So copper's just not good enough at the start of the game to start getting you the stuff that you really want. Now, this doesn't mean copper is completely useless throughout the game and you want to eventually trash them. Sometimes keeping that copper around can actually be useful. So when you play a card like Chapel and you are trashing the coppers, what you find is that on those turns, as particularly in the case with Chapel where you trash so much, you can't actually buy anything on those turns. Once you get rid of the coppers, you can't use them anymore for money, and that means in the short term you actually generate less money, and that can impact the sort of cards that you can buy. And so copper can sometimes be useful in the way that if you can't get your deck to the state where you're able to draw it every turn, and like the stop card space isn't something that you really care about, the coppers will continue to help you to achieve the price points that you want if you keep them around. So I've said here an example that Chapel and Big Money loses to pure Big Money, and that is true. So one of the reasons why Chapel Big Money is worse than regular Big Money is because when you trash those original coppers, not only are you having those turns where you're not doing anything, but the coppers throughout are giving you just that little bit extra economy that you need to reach the price points that you want. The Chapel Big Money has to like build back up again, and it loses a lot of momentum from doing that. The point of Chapel normally is that the cards that you get to add to your deck once you've trashed are so fast at building back up your momentum that you can catapult past the strategy that doesn't trash them. You regain the speed quickly and then catapult past it. But with Chapel Big Money, because you're adding the same sorts of cards that you would in regular Big Money, you're not really speeding yourself up, right? You're going back to maintaining that sort of same level of tempo, but you lost those early turns where you weren't doing anything. So, if the stop card space isn't important, and sometimes, you're not looking to draw, then the coppers actually are still useful for you. So there's a sort of a deck type that we call a slog. This is sort of its historic name. And those are decks where you're looking to just bloat your deck, often with cards that aren't actually drawing. So you're looking to add a load of like victory cards all the time. And you're just very slowly going to get through your deck. Coppers are really good in those cases, and that's because, to some extent, they bloat up your deck with useful, I say useful cards that you can actually use for some sort of value. When you are adding a lot of bad cards to your deck, in the case of a slog, because you're adding like literally unplayable victory cards, having a big bloated deck means that you just see the victory cards less often, right? Like adding one victory card to a deck that's already got 10 cards in it is much less of a proportional impact than adding a victory card to a deck that's only got 3 cards in it, right? You will see that bad card less often, and it won't impact your hand as much. So if your deck is looking to just add a lot of bad cards in it, then the coppers, their sort of anti-cycling effect is actually quite nice for you in that case. So if you're going for like a slog and loads of victory cards, you tend not to want to trash first and keep the coppers around. They're helpful for you then. So copper cost 0, we talked about how this is bad for trashing them. But actually, sometimes it's really good in that it's very easy to add coppers to your deck. You still need a buy or a gain to add a copper to your deck. However, you don't need any money, so sometimes you spend your money on other things and you have these spare buys, and you can quickly re-add coppers to your deck. Now, why would you, for example, trash all of your starting coppers and then re-buy them back again? Is that something that we would actually ever do? So when you trash the coppers, you are losing the ability to generate any money in the short term. But what you're getting from that is you are freeing up that stop card space. And once you free up that stop card space, this lets you hopefully build your deck back up a little bit more quickly with nicer cards like draw cards. And eventually you may hit the stage where you have quite a lot of spare draw. And in those sorts of cases, if you don't care that much about the stop card space anymore, you're re-adding some coppers back into your deck is a thing you can do, because the now is the time when the stop card space is less relevant. You need to sort of get your deck into the state where you're doing what's best at that stage of the game, and sometimes your deck will change throughout the game, and eventually it's like actually you don't care so much anymore about the stop card space. Like maybe you're adding a lot of victory cards to your deck, and then it's like, well, maybe it doesn't hurt so much to add coppers. It's still usually pretty bad in a deck that is trashed, where you trash your coppers. Often you're not looking to buy the coppers back again just because there are better alternatives. But, it's not unheard of to actually do it. And the fact that the copper is super cheap is often the reason why it gets picked in those cases as a way to generate money without having to spend your money on the cards that are going to give you more money. Very occasionally you also get these strategies where you want to buy lots and lots of cards for some reason. So I've given 2 examples here of like Gardens and Goons. These are cards that both really like you to buy a lot of cards and add them to your deck. Copper tends to be the card of choice in these cases because it's so cheap, but also there is the fact to consider that copper is usually the largest card pile in the game. And that means that you can buy coppers from that pile for quite a long time without actually at risk of emptying it. And that means that you're sort of not really drawing the game to a close. If you watch the Gardens video, we do talk about how there are the different sort of lengths that certain strategies want the game to go on for. And so by like adding treasures into your deck, the base treasures, because they're such big piles, you just get to spend a long time adding them to your deck, and sometimes that's relevant. So in the case of Goons, you want to be getting all of those victory points from your buys. So you want a card that you can buy a lot of, and in some cases you just want to keep doing that for a while, so you're not really looking to find some card that might end the game too quickly. You want to build up this big buffer of points, and so copper tends to get picked for this. Now let's move on to silver. So silver is a card that usually it's very common to add a silver to your deck towards the start of the game. Because your deck with all of its coppers and estates finds it quite hard to hit 5, and usually hitting 5 is going to be pretty good. You need to add something to your deck that is going to help you hit 5. And silver's pretty decent at modifying your starting deck to make the odds pretty good that you might hit 5. One thing that's important to note about silver is that I think that it's probably the single most over-gained card in the game. Like, silver is not a card that you always want to add a lot of copies of, but especially newer players, they tend to do it. Like, silver gets gained quite a lot by new players, when in reality they shouldn't be gaining it anywhere nearly as much as they do. So one of the problems is that silver, being the mid-tier between copper and gold, is actually not quite good enough to get you to 8. It really is a mid-tier card. If you think that you have a strategy where you are gaining a lot of silvers, and so you've only got these 5-card hands because you're not really able to do much else because you've mostly got silvers, you kind of need a very large density of silver to actually hit 8 on their own. Like, if you think that you might need 3 silvers and 2 coppers, or you're going to need 4 silvers and then like some victory card, if you're not having gold, you actually need a lot of silver. Like, how many silvers need to be in your deck to increase the odds enough to actually draw like 3 or 4 of them into your starting hand consistently? Like, you need a lot of silvers. I think in the Bureaucrat video I said it was something around about like 70-ish% or something of silver. That's a lot of silvers to add to your deck, and that's usually infeasible. So silver, just, you can't rely on it on its own to get you to 8 a lot of the time. Now, silver costs 3. This is actually a decent cost for silver. But, the fact that it is a stop card is sort of why it's not a very good card. It's better than copper. But, gold is better, as an example, right? Like, silver is still reasonably weak as a card, which is good. If it was very strong as a card, then you would actually be buying silver most of the time at 3. But because it's pretty weak, a lot of times, actually, sometimes you don't want to be buying silver at all. I would say a lot of games you buy 1 and probably like 2 silvers. But there are a lot of games where you won't necessarily go above that, and you're actually better off not buying anything at all when you start getting like your 3rd 3-cost card, if there's nothing better to get. So there's lots of cards out there that tend to gain silver and frame it as a positive. Like Bureaucrat, for example, but there's going to be like one of the boons that gives you a silver. Silvers is a card, like, of all of the cards that gainer cards will get you, like, most gainers are able to get you silver, and in some cases they sort of only gain you silvers. Do we want 3 silvers in our deck? I did talk about that you often don't really want to get like more than 2 in like your more traditional engine. Well, one of the nice things about gaining silvers for free is that sometimes that means that you get to spend your buys and the money that you're generating on actually adding engine components instead, right? You need to improve your deck in terms of drawing cards and also in terms of how it generates money as well. And if you are able to get the money generation part handled like for free by something else, then that means you can spend the rest of your focus on actually being able to draw your cards. So silver, sometimes it's all right when it's free. You don't really want to gain too many of them, though, and that's just because, it's the whole thing with stop card space that you can support. You often only want so many. If you overgain silvers, then you find that you suddenly can't draw your deck anymore, and that means that you won't sometimes be able to find those key cards that you want to play every turn, like a militia, for example. Now, costing 3 means that they tend to be reasonable fuel for various cost-relevant trashers. So if you have a card that like gains you the silver for free, a card like Remodel can come along and turn it into a 5-cost card, right? It's a reasonably okay price, 3 to use as fuel for trashing for cards that care about the cost of a card. So that's a reason why sometimes people tend to get a lot of them, or cards that specifically might gain silvers, is to just take use of the fact that it has some amount of value in its cost. It's almost like a like a cost pinata. Like there's that sort of value inherent in the 3 that it costs that is ready there to crack open by other cards and make use of. Now, how much are you able to draw and how much stock card space you can support is a really, really important factor of a lot of cards, of a lot of decks, So silver gets better when your deck is better at drawing cards. And that is just because of how easy it tends to be to gain. It's okay at what it does, and sometimes, if you can support a lot of stock cards, it's fine to have some slightly less efficient stock cards in there, just because they're not being too bad on your ability to draw your deck. So if you buy 2 silvers, while that's going to cost you 2 buys, it costs you a total of 6 coins. Gold also costs 6 coins and it generates you 3 money, but 2 silvers will generate you 4 money. So you actually, for the same amount of money spend, 2 silver is actually slightly more efficient in terms of the money you generate per the money that you spent on those cards. But it is using that extra stock card space if you have 2 silvers instead of a gold. In addition to that, silver in general, it's sort of the same idea as copper here. If you're not looking to draw your entire deck, then silver gets better, and that is just because the fact that it is using up some stock card space is not important. And silver is actually all right for its cost in terms of the amount of money that it generates you per stock card space. There are a fair number of action cards that are stock cards that will generate you money, and they also tend to generate 2 as well. It's a reasonable amount per stock card space. If you have 5-card hand and you have a lot of cards in your deck that generate you 2 coins per card, then that's sort of okay at hitting 8. But as we said at the start, it's not super great on its own, but it's reasonable. Now let's move on to gold. So one of the most important bits about gold, this is sort of a flashy card that new players tend to think is very good and get it early, but it's actually very, very overpriced for what you get from it. So there are a lot of Kingdom cards that can show up, particularly action cards. They cost 5, and they're actually going to be better for your deck than gold is. Too often you see new players try and go for a gold early, they hit 6, and they're like, oh, I'm going to get a gold because I've hit 6, and it's an expensive card. An expensive card should be better. But gold on purpose is actually overcosted. If you were to rank it accurately on what it does for you, it would probably just be a 5-cost card, and it wouldn't be a very good 5-cost card. But, that's That's just how it is. It's better for the game that it's overpriced, and that is just so that it gives more opportunity for the other 5-cost cards that can come out in the Kingdom to be relevant. Now, so even though gold is something that seems expensive and you might think, oh, I want to get this soon, it's a lot more important that you actually get your deck under control first. So a lot of the time, if you hit a 6 early, like maybe you can generate 6 on turn 3, like maybe you get a very lucky draw, like a silver and 4 coppers. You're usually better off adding in a card that helps you get your deck under control first. So you might want to buy like a sentry, for example, or I don't know, some sort of draw card. Now, gold is actually fine at doing what it does, and that is a stop card that generates you money and it doesn't cost you an action. Right, like, this is a lot better than silver and copper at doing that. Like, sometimes gold really is something that eventually you do have to add to your deck. You can have a kingdom where the basic treasures are the only way to actually generate money. Like, there are no action cards that actually give you coins. And in those cases, gold is perfectly fine, right? You might actually, you have to buy those sorts of cards, and you would much rather have gold than silvers or coppers, because it's just a lot better than those cards at doing the thing that it does, which is to generate you the money for one stock card. Now, it's much, much better to hit 8, a lot easier when you have golds than when you have silvers. So, like 2 golds and a silver, that gets you to 8. 3 golds gets you to 8. A gold, 2 silvers and a copper, that gets you to 8. A gold, a silver, 3 coppers. There's a load of examples, but you can see that you get a lot more opportunities to hit 8 when you have golds in your deck than when you have lots of silvers. And in fact, treasure-heavy decks and stuff like big money, they really, really want as many golds that they can get. If you get a lucky 6 on sort of like a big money board, getting a gold at that point actually will speed you up significantly in a number of cases. So, sometimes how fast a big money deck is going to be ultimately can depend on basically whether you get some lucky opportunities to buy gold early on, and that can actually shave a couple of turns off of how well you do. But what that means is that these sorts of decks tend to be pretty random in terms of how good they do. They're not very consistent. They are also like completely at the mercy, because they're only drawing 5 cards in a big deck. The random order that your cards appear in your deck tends to be very at the mercy of that. So they're sort of not that great, and they're very random, and they're very inconsistent. And I've reiterated here, when you want to draw your entire deck, you don't want to add a gold early. That, again, that's just to reiterate that it's important to get your deck under control. Usually you want to be drawing cards first before you focus on what we call payload, and gold is ultimately a payload card. It's sort of the thing that you eventually want to be doing when you're able to draw all of your cards, and that will be like generate a lot of money to buy provinces. And so gold is a payload. You tend not to add your payload early, you get your deck under control first. So there are a number of cards out there, like Bandit, for example, that can gain you golds directly. Gold is sort of unusual in that there's not really gainers out there that get you 6 cost cards, and there's actually very few that get you 5 cost cards, but there are way more cards that actually generate you golds in comparison. Gold is a pretty good card if you get it for free. Like, if you remember, I say that it's one of its biggest drawbacks was that it was overpriced. If you don't have to pay the price to get it, then that's really good. In addition to that, the fact that it is overpriced means that when you get it for free, you are getting a lot of cost, which is super great for cost-relevant trashing. Like, a lot of cost-relevant trashers get really, really good anytime there is a gold gainer on the board. So Remodel can turn golds directly into provinces, which is like, wow, that's super good. It's not so great if you have to actually buy the gold first and then remodel it into a province. But if you get the gold for free, then, remodel is just like gaining new provinces directly. And that's incredible value out of that. There are stuff like Apprentice that can draw you cards, and drawing 6 cards by trashing a gold, like that is a lot of cards to draw. So gold's really nice. Gold gainers I think tend to be strong, although we talk a lot about stock card space and that you want to be careful with stock card space. The reality is that if you add a lot of golds to a lot of decks, even though they might not be able to draw everything once you add a lot of golds, like, you're still going to have really good turns just because the golds are going to generate you quite a bit of money, right? It's not so bad sometimes if your deck doesn't finish drawing all of itself if you generated a ton of cash, and I guess you have the buys to support that, and because you still tend to have pretty good payoff in the end for your turn if you're generating a lot of money on your turn. So a question a lot of people have, that's quite a difficult question to answer about Dominion, is building up to Double Province. When do you choose to only get up to 8 and buy 1 province at a turn versus trying to build more to get at least like double province, or maybe even better than that. And sometimes whether or not you have to be buying golds is going to make a big difference in understanding this decision. That's for 2 reasons. Number 1 is because if you have to buy the golds yourself, the golds, because they're overpriced, you're not getting super great value if you're buying golds one at a time. And if all of your money has to come from these basic treasures, then you are adding a fair number of stop cards to your deck just to support being able to double province. So if you think that the only money, like you've got a deck where the only money you're getting is coming from these base treasure cards, you're going to need at least 6 of them in order to get up to 16 money, which is actually quite a lot of stop cards you need to support. So that comes in the form of like at least 4 golds and 2 silvers. That's going to be the cheapest way that you can get up to 16 out of those base cards, in terms of only having 6 cards available to you. And if you have to buy all of them, then you're spending quite a bit of money. So if you think about, let's say that you are able to generate 8 coins at the moment, like say you've got 2 golds and a silver, well, if you want to start buying these basic treasures to build up your deck, well, you're going to have to spend 1 turn, first of all, buying a gold, then you're going to have to spend another turn buying a gold and a silver, and that'll get you up to 16, but then you might have to spend another turn buying draw and villages, like a village smithy pair, to try and support those extra stop cards. And so what you find is that, you've taken 3 turns to get up to double province, and that's happened before you're able to start buying some provinces. So yeah, you can buy them. You can now get up to 4 provinces in 2 turns instead of 4, but you spent 3 more turns to get there, for a total of 5 turns instead of 4 turns. And so that can sometimes slow you down enough that going up to double province isn't going to be worth it. Now, we're going to talk, when we talk about province, it's actually a bit more complicated than that. But generally, because gold is inefficient to buy, you can find that you can't improve your deck quickly enough when you're reliant on purchasing golds. Something important to notice, if you look at a card like Poacher, this is what we call cantrip coin, giving you +1 card, +1 action, +1 coin. In theory, if you add just only 1 of those to this sort of deck, then you only need 5 stock cards to hit 16, right? Because you can get 5 golds and then 1 cantrip coin. And you're not necessarily going to have only 5 golds, because you're probably going to have some silvers to get up to that. But if you can add other ways of generating money, particularly non-stop card forms, like maybe you've got a village that gives you money, like Bazaar, or you get a lot of merchants and stuff, then it's a lot easier to support getting the money that you need to go up to double province, just because you need less golds, and the fact that all of these treasures were stop cards, is sort of their big drawback in this case. Anyway, that's it for the basic treasures. We're now going to move on to the victory cards. And we're going to start off with province. So we're doing these in the reverse order because province is by far the most important one, and it's the one that I've got the most to discuss. So we're going to start off with province, and then we're going to go down to duchy and estate. So province, in a lot of games, province really is sort of the aim of the game. The most common goal is people trying to get more provinces than their opponent. Province is very good in terms of points per coin and points per stop card. So it's 6 points for one stop card space. And you're getting not quite 1 point per coin. It's 0.75 points per coin. And that's a lot more efficient than duchy and estate. In addition to that, the province pile is a special pile in that the game ends when it is emptied. And that makes it rewarding sometimes to try and eliminate all of the provinces from the pile. So province is very often a goal. You do see just not quite as often, but I think games at the high level tend to be almost evenly split between province endings and 3 pile endings. And not counting like early resignations. So provinces very frequently they are the main sort of thing that you're aiming towards. It's actually a good card, province, despite the fact that you can't play it. It's a pretty strong card. Very expensive, though. Now, let's consider games where there is no other alternate VP available, like, say, there's no gardens, and also you're not junking each other. When you look at games like that, there is a fixed number of points that are available in the supply, and that is 80, right? In 2-player, there are 8 cards in each pile, and 6 plus 3 plus 1, that's 10. So you've got 80 points around. The province pile gives you 48 of those 80 points, so it makes up more than half of all of the points that are available. In fact, if you get 7 provinces, that is 42 points. And it's not possible for your opponent to catch up if you do that. So although we say that 8 provinces empties the pile for a win, you actually only need 7 of them to win in a lot of games. Your opponent just doesn't have enough points available. Note that I'm not considering the 3 starting estates in this analysis. I'm assuming in this case that either both players still have them all, or both players trashed them all, and therefore they don't really contribute any meaningful change. So if you get 7 provinces in a lot of these sort of standard games, you win. Another way to win is that if you get 6 provinces, then you only need 1 duchy and 2 estates, and that gets you to 41 points out of the 80. Now, getting 1 duchy and 2 estates is not that difficult, so getting up to 6 provinces tends to be good enough for you to win the game in a lot of cases. For the opponent to deny you like any duchies at all, it's actually not necessarily going to be that easy. So 6 provinces tends to be your goal to lock out the game. This sort of victory condition, by the way, I talked about it in my Gardens game, but even though 6 provinces, 1 duchy and 2 estates doesn't actually end the game on its own, this is a victory condition that we tend to call 50% VP, where there just isn't enough points available for your opponent to actually beat you anymore. And it's as good as ending the game in reality. You've guaranteed a win at that point. If you get only up to 5 provinces, winning the province split 5-3, that's a 12-point difference on provinces compared to going even with your opponent and splitting it 4-4. 12 points is quite a lot. If you think that the duchies are worth 3 points each, and there's 8 of them, that's half of the duchy pile, just because you happened to pick up 1 extra province over your opponent, right? Because you sort of don't pick up 1 extra province when you get 1 more. It's actually, you end up 2 ahead. So we call that a 12-point swing. That's a lot of points to win by. So as you can see, winning the province split in a lot of ways is very, very important for the game. It gives you such a massive advantage, and it's very easy to get most of the points in the game if you can win that province split. Problem is that province is a very, very expensive card. It costs 8, and that's a really big deal. It's actually quite hard to hit 8 a lot of the time. And if you want to hit it consistently, you do need to build up quite a bit to get your game into that state. Sometimes you can hit 8 early on, and you really don't want to buy a province in that case. If you think that these pure victory cards do nothing for you until the very end of the game, if you buy one early, then sure, you've got those points. But you've also got this useless stop card, and you will see it more often, and it will interfere with your hands a lot more often. And usually that loses you tempo to the extent where it's worse to do it. You really, as a general rule, what you want to do is you only want to add victory cards as late as possible. So the platonic ideal that sort of doesn't really happen a lot of the time is going to be something like called a mega turn, where you buy all 8 provinces on the final turn of the game, and then it doesn't matter how many victory cards you added to your deck, because you will never draw them, because you never get another turn. And as a general extension of that concept, the later a victory card is added to your deck, the less turns it has to actually interfere with your deck. So sort of recommend that you only really want to buy victory cards late. Now, you don't want to wait too long, of course, or else your opponent can sort of get ahead of you if they start earlier. So a big factor of strategy in Dominion is understanding when it is time to start buying victory cards. And it's not always a very easy decision, to be fair. It's a pretty difficult part of the strategy. Here we go. I've just talked about what my next slide is about. Deck tempo is very important. So if your deck builds too slowly and proves itself too slow, what you find is that your opponent, who might be going for a different strategy, has a chance to catch up. So if you bought a province early, you will have that early points lead. But your opponent, who builds up faster and better than you because they don't have to deal with that, they get a chance to catch up, and oftentimes they will catapult past you. Or alternatively, if your deck is too slow and it takes you too long to actually start picking up any points at all, an opponent might have something like a workshop garden strategy where they 3-pile as quickly as possible, and even though they don't necessarily get all that many points, they might be able to do it faster than you can get your deck ready to overtake them on provinces. So, be careful of that. The game is sort of, in many ways, determined by the person who correctly recognizes which decks have the correct tempo, which is something that's only really going to come from a lot of practice. The best players sort of have this great intuition of understanding, looking at the cards that are available as to how long the game is going to go on for, and sort of the rate at which points are added to that deck and when the points start coming as well. Some decks will build a lot and then add a load of points very quickly at the end. And so all the points will suddenly jump into their deck all at one stage. And they're sort of hoping that the game will go on long enough to reach that stage. Whereas other decks will start adding points very quickly, but they sort of remain a little bit flatter in terms of the points added per turn, and they are sort of hoping that the game will end before the player who is building a lot gets that big point spike suddenly into their deck, because that's the time when they will lose. Sometimes you get these decks that add cards to them really, really fast. And when that happens, piles can sometimes empty so quickly. The game is at risk of ending at any time, and players don't really have the chance to build up their economy to get up to province. So whenever decks have a lot of gaining, so they have really strong workshop variants, they can gain a lot of cards to their deck easily, but they don't actually have very much money. These sorts of decks really tend not to go for provinces. And, intuitively that is because province needs a lot of coin. So if you're able to bring the game to a close without ever generating a lot of coin, well, provinces just aren't really going to be that important for you. A really, really important rule in Dominion strategy that's been around for a long time is something that we call the Penultimate province rule. So the most important province in the game, you might think that it is the last province in the pile, because when you buy it, the game ends. But it's actually the one before that, the second last province. Part of the reason for that is because when you buy that province, what you do is you throw the game into this state where your opponent is now able to end the game on their turn. And how your opponent wins is that they are able to end the game while they have a points lead. So if your opponent is simply not able to be in a position where they get to choose to end the game when it's favourable for them, that puts them in a much worse strategy. So sometimes you just don't want your opponent to get into that state. And this is when you start using this rule. So you may see games that happen where the province pile gets down to 2. And neither player is able to buy a province from that pile, because if they do that, the other player might be able to just province an estate, and then they win. So they have to leave that province alone. And so they move on to duchies instead. And then what they do is they empty the duchies one at a time, and eventually there comes down to 2 duchies left. And the same rule still applies, probably because the game will 3 pile as soon as they take those duchies. If emptying the duchy pile would end the game, then this rule will apply to that. So even though it's called the penultimate province rule, it's generally this idea that if you take the second last province, or sometimes duchy, and doing that does not put you in the lead by enough that your opponent cannot get into the lead when they end the game on their next turn, then you shouldn't be buying that second last province. So if buying a province put you, say you only have 1 buy, to keep this simple and no extra gains. So if buying the second last province does not put you 7 points ahead of your opponent, then what happens is that your opponent can buy the last province on their turn, gain 6 points, and now they're in the lead and they've just ended the game. So what you want to do is you want to avoid picking up that province in that case if you are going to put your opponent in a situation where they can win. Now, sometimes you are in a state where you're far behind enough that actually, if you buy the province, your opponent's in the lead, and by buying that province, the second last one, they are still in the lead, then you haven't really changed the situation that much. You actually do need all 12 points in order to win. In those sorts of cases, you probably should just take the second last province, because you're sort of running a gamble on the hope that your opponent cannot buy either one of those 2 provinces, because if they can, then they win anyway. Say your opponent has 5 provinces. Well, we know that if they get to 7 provinces, they're guaranteed to win. So in that case, you might as well buy a province, because if your opponent... okay, now let's not say 5. Let's say they're at 6. Right, you know that they win if they hit 7 provinces. So if you don't have any provinces at all, you might as well buy 1 province, because if your opponent buys 1 more and gets up to 7, then they're guaranteed a win anyway. So, you just buy it as it is. Now, bear in mind tie-breaking. So if second player sort of has an advantage in this regard, in that they can... if they are tied with their opponent, they can buy a province and end up exactly 6 points ahead, and they can then make it so that the first player cannot buy the last province, because then they will be tied on points, and player 1 will actually lose because they've had 1 more turn. So player 2 is quite strong on tie-breaking in this regard. The penultimate province rule does not necessarily apply to player 2 sometimes, because they win tie-breaks, and that puts them in a much stronger position sometimes. One last thing to note about the penultimate province rule is that we've sort of been talking about this under the understanding that you only gain 1 card per turn. Sometimes, both players are in a situation where they can double province, and then instead of the penultimate province rule applying to the penultimate province, it actually applies to the 3rd or the 4th province. It's the same sort of rule, it's just that the number of points that the opponent can gain on 1 turn is just increased, and so that just sort of increases which province that this rule applies to. So let's go back to this question that we talked about in the gold section of this video. When do you build more? So a very common decision that you have to make in the game is when do you go from starting to buy just one province per turn to buying multiple victory cards per turn, like a double province turn. Well, if you consider again the rule we talked about earlier, where you kind of want to add victory cards as late as possible, if you are able to add more victory cards on one turn, you can sort of delay the time at which you start adding victory cards to your deck. And that just means that there are less turns, hopefully, where you actually draw those victory cards and they interfere with your deck. So victory cards have less of an impact the later you add them on. So the more victory cards you can add to your deck on a turn, the later you can make that decision. And generally, that's going to be better for you. But ultimately, the speed at which you can improve your deck is the important factor. So, again, this is sort of similar to what we were talking about in the gold video, that if you have to buy the golds one at a time, like that tends to get pretty slow, and so you may find that it just takes too long to improve your deck fast enough. But some decks can start to build up pretty quickly, and some decks tend to build up even faster as the game goes on. So like they're pretty good at accelerating. So in one turn, like they might look like they're adding slowly to their deck, but then as turns go on, they start adding more and more cards per turn, right? Their ability to add more cards to their deck also goes up. And sort of trying to have an understanding of what your deck might look like in 2 turns' time, if you just keep building, can be really important for understanding if you need to double province, because your deck could be way, way better than it is now in just a small number of turns based on what's available. This includes stuff like gainer cards like workshop, gaining more workshops so that in a future turn you can start to add even more cards to your deck per turn. You know, those sorts of things can speed you up. Or like if you're adding more throne rooms to your deck or something, you know, you just sort of get these turns where suddenly your deck's output, its payload, increases very significantly all of a sudden in a deck. And those sorts of decks are going to be way better at going to like double province and building up faster. Now, if it's sort of like a tie, if you try and think about the decision in some ways about how long it's going to take you to get up to 4 provinces, if you think that, if I built more, that's going to take me the same length of time than if I buy provinces one at a time, then you should probably go for building more. And part of the reason why is that tends to win that tiebreak, largely because decks that built more should be more resilient to adding victory cards to them in general. Part of the reason why is because they are bigger. And so after you've built more, like when you add a victory card at last to your deck, it takes up a smaller proportion of your deck, and so it has like a slightly less impact. Another reason why is that you might have the chance to build your deck a little bit more to support more stop cards, and as a result, the victory cards just don't get in the way anywhere nearly as much. And another reason why is because if you build up to do stuff like double province, then your deck is also more capable of adding more other forms of victory points to their deck. So a deck that can double province is also a deck that might be able to triple duchy, whereas someone who is only single provincing might only be able to add 1 duchy per turn if they had to start adding duchies, and you can see how that gives the player that built a much, much better position once they reach the end game, because they can continue to add points at a reasonable pace, whereas the person who's single provinced, just his deck just starts to peter out and slow down. Sometimes province is not the best form of victory points in the deck. This is just something to realise. Like, I've given a whole load of examples here. These are all the first sort of things that came to my mind of cards that can be better at gaining you points than province. I'm not going to go into them all here, but bear in mind that there's a lot, and there's actually more than I've written here. But every single one of these cards could be getting you a more efficient, in theory, form of points in terms of both like cost per point or in terms of like stock card space per point. So yeah, just bear in mind sometimes province, there are just better alternatives available. So let's move now on to duchy. So duchy is giving you half of the points of province, and it only costs just a little bit more than half of the cost of a duchy. So you're losing out a little bit on points per coin, but you are spending twice as much stock card space with duchy. So I like to think that duchy in some ways is sort of a stock card space tax. So if games have to go on to them wanting to pick up duchies, then something that tends to be really, really important is how well your deck can deal with having a lot of stock cards added to it. Stock card space is just way more important for duchy than it is for province a lot of the time. So duchies reward decks that are either really, really good at drawing or decks that don't care to draw at all and are sort of going for the really slow cycling, like treasure-based kind of deck, because those sorts of decks can handle stock cards more effectively. So if you think about a super thin deck like Chapel, and it eventually gets itself down to like just 2 golds and 1 silver, and it tries to get there as quickly as possible, then it'll be able to start buying provinces pretty quickly. But if it ends up having to go into a protracted end game where it's buying duchies, like it's really gonna struggle. Like super thin decks can get clogged up very hard by duchies, because decks that are really thin, again, every victory card that you add is proportionally a larger chunk of the deck compared to how many cards that it had before. Duchies are important in that they let you come back from losing the province split. They give you another way to score points without worrying about provinces as much. However, you've really got to be able to handle having the duchies in your deck. So how many duchies do you need? Well, if you lose the province split 3-5, then you're going to need to win the duchy split like 6-2 in order to continue to have a chance of winning the game. This is going back to that state where there's like no other forms of victory cards available, like we were discussing under when we were talking about provinces. So this could mean that you've like built up to a double province deck, and you now need to get like 3 duchies per turn. So if you think that you're playing an opponent who can only gain 1 point per turn, like if they can gain 1 duchy per turn but you can get 3, then you can win that duchy split 6-2. Obviously, if all the provinces have gone 5-3, then the game is over. So you've got to think about this is the sort of game it applies to where you are looking like the game is going to be that you are losing the split. You start duchying a little bit sooner. But bear in mind that even if you do lose the province split 5-3, if you can get all 8 duchies, then you do actually win the game in that case, because 3 provinces and 8 duchies puts you over that 40 points from the supply threshold that you're looking for to get 50% VP. Now, if you're going to lose the provinces 2-6, then you actually do need all 8 duchies. While it is theoretically possible to only get 7 of the duchies, your opponent will then only need 2 estates, which is pretty easy for them to get most of the time. And if you do end up getting all duchies, then you are also going to need to win the estate split as well. So you're going to need to get at least 5 of the estates. So losing provinces 6-2 is pretty bad. That's a lot of duchies that you need, but it is recoverable. So keep that in mind. Now, when do you start going for duchies over provinces? Well, obviously, if the province pile empties, then the game is just suddenly over. So you obviously can't let that happen, and you need to start going for duchies a little bit earlier. If you and the opponent are sort of both picking up picking up provinces at around the same time at around the same rate. You kind of want to focus on getting the provinces first because they're more important. And then you start running into stuff like the penultimate province rule, and you will move on to duchies, and then you will go through like a protracted end game that people call duchy dancing. The game just sort of keeps going on because the penultimate province rule stops people from ending it anytime soon. When this is happening and you'll start to like duchy dance, you will be expecting that players' decks are going to start to struggle. So this is why you sort of go for the provinces first, because you can hit 8 now, but soon as you start adding victory cards, and a lot of them, to your deck, you may actually struggle to continue to hit 8 sometimes. So get the provinces first, and then as your deck starts to get a little bit worse, you start missing 8, but that's okay because you can hopefully continue to hit 5 and pick up the duchies. Now, sometimes you're in the case where your opponent has got a lead first, like they start doing 1 province per turn while you are building up to like double province turns, and so they're a little bit ahead of you. And sometimes they're ahead enough that it's looking very likely that you won't be able to match them on the number of provinces, and they're going to be able to get more provinces than you. In that case, as we just discussed earlier, it's really important that you get a lot of duchies. So you might actually want to consider getting more duchies first rather than the provinces. Now, you're always free to take 1 province, because if your opponent gets 7, then they win anyway, so it doesn't matter that their 7th province actually ends the game because they had at least 50% of the points. So the reason why you would sort of go for duchies first in this case, you want to stop your opponent sneaking in a win by emptying the province pile. So if you think you're going to lose, like the province pile 5-3, then you kind of don't want to buy 3 provinces first, because then as you're going to look to start catching up on duchies and buying those 6 duchies that you need, your opponent has the chance to pick up their 5th province, and then the game suddenly ends and they end with a win because you haven't picked up enough duchies yet. So what you want to do is you want to make it so that they are forced to keep hitting 8 and try and buy the provinces and just keep buying them and try not to miss that. And you're sort of hoping that their deck isn't good enough while you start snapping up all the duchies that you're going to need anyway. This also means that as the opponent's deck does start to miss hitting 8, hopefully there just aren't any, or there are very few duchies left for them to pick up, and so they sort of end up trapped in a state where they can't get the duchies when they miss 8, and so they have to go back to building up their deck to try and hit 8. You know, they can't just start moving on to picking up duchies because you've snapped them all up, or at least most of them up. Now, you know, in these cases, the question can then become, okay, you know, is it now worth, like, is either one of these players, does it become worth, instead of going for more points, to start buying like golds and silvers or draw cards and try and get back up to hitting 8 consistently? Well, yes, sometimes it's going to be the case, and in those cases one would hope that the player who built more will have an easier time of building their deck back up to the state where they can start buying provinces one at a time. In fact, if they built up their deck to the place where they can get like double province, then even if they miss a double province or like a 3 duchy turn, odds are good that they're still going to be able to buy 1 province, right? So their deck will keep going for longer even though it's not achieving the full output. So that means that they are free to just buy a load of duchies first, and their deck can still sort of, it's spluttering on a bit more, but it's still a lot more capable than the player who is trying to just rush the provinces one at a time. Now, this is all sort of somewhat theoretical. Obviously, sometimes you can get an opponent that can just very, very consistently buy 1 province per turn, and they're not going to stop hitting 8. And in those sorts of cases, it might just be that you are doomed, right? Like, you took too long. And even though you can make a desperation play to start buying all of the duchies, they're still going to get to like 7 provinces before you can do anything about it. And then, oh well, right, you just lost in that case. So these sorts of discussions here do not always apply. There are more concerns with duchies, and that is 3 pile problems. So duchies do not end the game on their own, but when the pile empties, that is one of the 3 piles you need. If 2 piles have already been emptied, then if one player is behind on provinces and they're looking to snap up a load of duchies, this can actually be at their disadvantage, and that can be because, if you lose the duchy split 5-3, you need 6 out of the 8 duchies to match your opponent, but then you're also going to start needing like some estates to actually get the win. And what you can end up happening is that you sort of end up in a state where you can't get all 6 of your duchies yet, because as soon as you buy that 6th duchy, the game is over, and so instead you're going to have to go and spend a little bit more time buying some estates first, and that just gives your opponent, who won the province split, an extra chance to just buy like an extra duchy and get a 3rd duchy, and in that case, they win. Basically, you don't get enough duchies to actually ever catch up on them. So you can sort of, if piles have already emptied a fair amount, this is usually going to support the player who has gained the points lead early, because it gives them more opportunities to just suddenly end the game. Now the game won't just end when the province pile empties, it will end when any pile empties. So that sort of hurts duchies as a catch-up mechanism. Now, we've talked a lot about the basic victory cards being the only sort of victory cards available, but sometimes there will be other sources of victory points, so gardens, for example, in the base game. Generally, when there are other forms of victory points available, duchies tend to get less valuable. Not always, but on the whole, they tend to. So duchy itself is sort of like an alternate victory card, but it tends to be fairly weak. So if you think that a lot of the time, like gardens are going to be worth the same number of points as duchy, but they're cheaper, and also they have the possibility to suddenly jump up to be worth a bit more points. So, just that sort of basic kingdom card. A lot of the kingdom cards that can appear as one of the 10 kingdom cards that you pick, they're often always sort of balanced at the idea that they're going to be better than duchy, and that means that, province still remains the dominant method, but they give you another alternative that's just a little bit better than duchy, generally, right? So it's almost impossible to talk about every sort of thing that can happen in Dominion. We have to talk about these general rules that won't always apply. But yeah, just bear in mind that when you start adding other victory cards, duchy as the whole tends to get a little bit less. Sometimes here, you can see a case where the alternate VP is good enough that you can actually ignore province entirely. And in that case, duchy is sometimes, because it's so much easier to get, it can be a case where the duchy plus your alternate victory point card is good enough to actually beat a provincing player without ever buying any provinces, and that is because as you add more points to the supply, provinces no longer become the majority point source in the kingdom, and so they lose a bit of power in that regard, right? They can't get to 50% VP by getting 7 provinces or getting 6 and then a few other points, because there's just way more points available. So they have to work a little bit harder, the province player. And sometimes you can find a game where those sort of high gain, low economy decks that I've talked about before, where the game can start to 3-pile suddenly, and nobody's built up the money to get to province. Well, a lot of the stuff here we talk about province can then shift over to duchy instead, right? People just aren't able to get up to 8, but they can hit 5. And so they start treating duchies in the same way we would treat provinces, and that is because the duchy pile will now end the game. So just bear in mind that in those sorts of cases, everything that we've talked about sort of applies, but to duchies instead of provinces. But there is one thing to watch out for in this case, and that is that the other player may think, oh, well, I'm not going to join you on the duchies. They get another alternative option, which is to start building up to province, and then go for them as well. And if they use like the base treasures to build up their economy, bear in mind that the base treasure piles tend not to empty a lot of the time. So they are able to add more cards to their deck without contributing to lowering the piles that matter for 3 pile. And then they get to start buying provinces all of a sudden that are going to be way better than the duchies. So that option is basically always available to you. If you get to the state where it's looking like duchies are going to be the only thing that matters, you do need to consider, well, hang on, what if I look to instead add money to my deck and go for provinces instead? Is that going to be better? Is that going to be faster? Keep it in mind, is all I can say. So now let's move on to the estates. So just talking generally before we talk about estates, games of Dominion, how many points you get in games varies pretty wildly a lot of the time. No 2 games are necessarily going to be the same in terms of how many points they can get and also how close points can be. So if you think about a game where the whole aim is to kick off what we call a bridge mega turn, and that is something where you buy all 8 provinces in one turn. Well, when one player manages to do that, the point difference that they have compared to their opponent is going to be huge, right? It's going to be like 48 points difference. And that might look like that it was a complete blowout, and it's like, wow, you got thrashed by your opponent. But the truth is that the other player could have also had the proper hand to do a bridge mega turn on their turn. They just happened to miss out by 1 point. So it was actually a really close game. It just didn't look it. In other cases, you can have a game where one player has so much control of the game over the other player that, they sneak out a 3-pile ending and then they pick up 1 estate and they win. And so they beat their opponent by 1 point. But actually, it wasn't even close. Like, if the other player started provincing, it wouldn't have been any problem at all for the player that ultimately won to start provincing and just beat them quite heavily on that. So games that are close in terms of points were not necessarily also close. So you don't know just by the score alone how close a game was. But because games can sometimes be close and sometimes they can be like total blowouts with big differences, that is sort of the main thing that depends on whether or not estates are going to matter or not. So we talked about if you lose the province split 5-3, then that is a 12-point difference in points. Now, if you have all 8 estates, that's not enough points to actually catch up on a 12-point difference. So estates wouldn't even matter in that case, right? Like the entire pile was worth so few points that it didn't really matter how many estates you got. Like, you just lost by so many points because you didn't get enough provinces. But because estates are really, really cheap and they also do give you points, sometimes they are really important in 3-pile endings because all you need is the 1 point to actually win the game over your opponent. If you could just end the game and then pick up a single point, that's it. That's all you need. And estate is usually really good for that. So, these are sorts of the high gain games I talked about where you sort of never get up to buying any other victory cards. Sometimes you can just end 3 piles and just pick up an estate and you win. All sorts of gainers, like Workshop, but all others. There's a lot of gainers out there that can gain estates really easily just because they care about cost. A remodel can just turn a single copper into an estate. And if you are able to 3-pile on the same turn that you do that, you gained a point from the remodel, which is all you needed. So that's sort of a very common use case for estate, is just sort of winning these tie breaks with a single point. Something that's really important to note here is that sometimes you have these boards where you don't have any extra gains and you're only able to add 1 card to your deck. per turn. The 3 estates that you start with, in boards like that, sometimes it can be helpful when estate trashing is available to not trash one of your estates. And what that does is that puts you in a 1-point lead, where if you and your opponent end up going to split the province pile 4-4, you would actually always win in that case because you have this extra point. And so therefore, the estate really matters. And the problem is, because you can only gain 1 card per turn, it's really hard for your opponent to also gain their own estate, because they have to spend an entire turn in order to just pick up that 1 estate. So watch out for that situation. That can be very strong. Sometimes you just have that opportunity when gaining is hard to get a single estate just to win tiebreakers. Estates in general also award players who have more gains than their opponent, and that is because when you think about stuff like 3-pile endings, imagine that there is only 1 pile left to end the game, and it has, say, 3 cards left in it. Well, if your opponent has only 3 gains, they could gain those 3 cards, but they would probably end up tying the game, or if they were first player, ending on a loss because they had more turns than you. But if you can gain 4 cards on your turn, then you have an opportunity to buy those 3 cards and 1 estate. And in that case, you win, no matter whether you're first or second player, just because you have more points. So estates reward players that are able to have more what we call pile control, more ways to buy cards on their last turn. And that is because it just gives them that extra point gaining possibility over their opponent. Now, a thing in 2-player that you need to watch out for, people can miss this quite a lot, but it's actually really important. It takes 16 money to double province, but it also takes 16 money to gain and buy all 8 estates from the estate pile. Now, you do need 8 buys in order to do that. That's like playing 7 markets or whatever. And sometimes that's not feasible, but sometimes you just have a huge number of buys available to you. And when that is possible, you can do what we call pile driving the estate pile. So you just have a turn where you just buy all 8 estates. Now, if 2 piles are empty, sometimes you can sneak in a sudden 3-pile end to the game by just emptying the estate pile, because it only has 8 cards in it. It's a lot easier to do than many other piles. And the fact that it also gives you points is what can help you win. 8 points is more than a single province. So if you have enough points that 8 points is enough to end the game, then you can just grab all of the estates and win that way. I've seen this a number of times, so I'd say it's probably more common than you think. But do watch out for that. And it's not just buys. Sometimes other things that gain can help you do it as well. So you need to always keep in mind all of the gains that you have, because stuff like workshop can contribute to helping you gain all of the estates in 1 turn. Now, we've talked a lot there about buying estates, but as you know, estates start off in your hand at the start of the game a lot of the time, and estates are really, really bad in your starting deck. They are completely useless, and it takes the entire game for that 1 point to actually pay off. And as we've discussed in a lot of games, the 1 point or the 3 points that come from those starting estates just won't matter at all. The game's end point distribution won't be close enough for that to matter. So the estates that you start with tend to be a very high priority for trashing. They're a lot worse than the coppers that you start with, because even though you have more coppers, and the coppers are sort of a worse junk card and they don't cost anything, at least you can actually play them throughout the game to generate you money, but you can't really do that with the estates. Because the estates cost 2, they are therefore also a lot better targets for stuff like remodel. These cost relevant trashers. So there you go. So that's estate. I think that's all I had to say on it. That's quite a lot of information there about these victory cards. They're a big part of the game. of Dominion. They all have their own opportunities to shine, even though Province is nice and big and flashy. There's still one more that we haven't talked about yet, and that is, of course, the Curse. So Curse is, I hope it's pretty obvious, but it is by far the worst card in all of Dominion. It's specifically designed to be the worst card in all of Dominion. It gives you -1 point, and it's a completely useless stop card. And it's not even a victory card, so a lot of cards that care about victory cards and that combo off of it, this is not the case with Curse. So it's actually a lot worse than, like, the estates that you start with in your deck, even if you ignore the points. Like, it's just a different type of card that's just really bad. Obviously, you're not going to be buying Curses in most games. And in fact, in a lot of games, the Curse pile will never be touched, right? Now, while the Curses do lose you points, and that is a thing that matters, sort of like how sometimes the estates are irrelevant, well, sometimes the point loss from Curses is also irrelevant. The points that you lose from the Curse tend to only matter when the end scores are expected to be close, sort of in the same way as estate. However, the fact that the Curse is an unplayable stop card is by far and away the worst part of it. So the reason why we tend to want to junk our opponents very quickly is because the Curses are stop cards and not because they actually lose our opponent's points. Speaking of junking attacks, usually when there are junking attacks that give Curses to your opponent, this is the time when Curses will actually get into play in the game. This is by far and away the most common reason why Curses have any sort of impact on the game at all. And when there are good junking attacks available, like Witch, what you find is that the Curse pile will tend to empty just because junking your opponent is so strong and because the Curses are so bad for your opponent. And that means that the 3-pile endings are, to some extent, could be more likely. I forget sometimes that the Curse pile is actually one of the 3 piles and will end the game, and I have actually lost some games online because it suddenly ended on me. I was like, oh, why is it the end of the game? And it's like, oh yeah, that's because the Curse pile is empty. So you really got to watch out for this, right? It's still a supply pile, still counts towards the end of the game. If there is no trashing at all, and there is the presence of a junking attack, then you will have so many stop cards between the 10 that you start with and the Curses that you gain that drawing your deck can, most of the time in those situations, it's just not possible. Like, just don't even think about it. Like, it's not worth trying to build because you have so many stop cards that you will probably never, even if you had like all of the smithies and all of the villages, you might not actually get to the state where you can reliably draw your deck because your starting hands, the distribution of the cards, even if you can support that many stop cards, just the way that the cards come in a random order can end up just you pick up only stop cards and, well, that's the end of your turn. So, cursing really matters quite a lot in terms of making engines, deck drawing non-viable. Sometimes we have these things that I refer to as soft junkers, so they can give out Curses, but they don't actually necessarily do it very reliably or every time they are played. So Replace from Intrigue or Jester from... Is it Cornucopia? It might be Hinterlands. I think it's Cornucopia. Giant from Adventures. These are attack cards that do not necessarily give out Curses every time they are played. Similarly, cards that hex. These are random attacks that can happen, and one of them dishes out Curses, but it's one of, I can't remember if it's 12 or 13 hexes, so you really don't see it very often. In these cases, the Curse pile might not empty, but it can get reasonably close, and what that means is that because Curse is a 0-cost card, it's pretty easy to buy them. You can sometimes win if you have enough of a point lead by just buying the remaining Curses. It becomes just this pile that's not great, but it is really, really low, and that matters. Don't forget that you can do it. Could you buy every Curse? Right, in 2-player games, there are 10 Curses. You can theoretically buy or gain all of them to empty the pile yourself. Now, of course, that's going to lose you 10 points, right? You have to be significantly in the lead for that to be viable, but it still is a thing that you can do, right? Don't forget that just because you don't have much money doesn't mean that there isn't still a pile that is available if you got all of the gains and buys for it that you can empty. I have won a game before by, on one turn, just buying all 10 curses, but decks, you don't see them that often where that is possible, and you have to be enough in the lead for it to actually be viable. When you start adding more players than 2-player games, you get a lot more curses in the pile. So in a 3-player game, there's 20 curses instead of 10. In a 4-player game, there's 30. It's just not possible to pile drive in those cases. It's certainly... when are you ever going to see someone buy all 20 curses in a 3-player game, right? It's probably happened at some point, but I've never heard of an example of it happening. This is sort of a 2-player only thing. And even then, it's still pretty rare, even in 2-player. Lastly, there can be situations where curses are actually a positive point for you. I've got 2 examples here, Fairgrounds and Museum. In these cases, you may find that buying a single curse can actually earn you points. There was a game that I won once which had Museum, and my opponent figured that I couldn't win, but then on my turn I had one more buy, and I bought a curse, and overall that gave me 1 extra point, and that caused me to win the game. So, curses, it's not all bad. Again, this requires a very specific support in order to happen, but that's sort of a reason why you can buy curse. Now, there are other cards that interact with curses and give you other reasons to buy them. I've explicitly not mentioned them here, so if you were wondering if I was going to talk about Defiled Shrine or Ambassador, no, I'm not. This video's gone on for long enough, and we will talk about those when we actually talk about those cards in general. Yeah, so anyway, this was a slightly unusual video. Obviously, I'm not going to be doing the random kingdom analysis because I've already done a lot of those, and these cards appeared in every single one of those in all of my other videos, so I don't think I need to do one specifically for these base cards. Anyway, if you stuck around for all of this, thanks. I hope it was good for you. And next time I make a video, it will be some card from Intrigue. That's what we're going to do next. Move on to another expansion at last. Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope you really enjoyed this, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.